What is up, weather enthusiasts? I'm your host, Pat's Path Predictor. Let's get right into the weather. Alright, so here's the situation we have for you, ladies and gentlemen. We now have a 100% chance of development in the next 48 hours and 7 days with that area of interest, which is now Invest 90E out in the eastern Pacific Ocean. And we have more information on that tropical wave and that potential tropical development in the Caribbean Sea as more models and more data have been picking up on it. And we have a lot to go over with you today on that. So let's go ahead and dive right into it right here. Let's go ahead and start with the NHC's latest advisory on Invest 90E in the Eastern Pacific. South of the southern coast of Mexico, satellite imagery shows showers and thunderstorms becoming better organized near a broad area of low pressure located several hundred miles south of the coast of southern Mexico. While the system still lacks a well-defined circulation, environmental conditions are favorable for further development, and a tropical depression or tropical storm is expected to form tonight or on Wednesday as the low moves generally west-northwestward at around 10 miles per hour. Formation chance the next 48 hours is high, near 100%. Formation chance through the next 7 days is high, near 100%. And typically, when you see near 100% chances of development like this, it either means A, it's going to be tagged as a tropical depression at around 4 p.m. Central Time, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, or in this case 2 p.m. Pacific Time, or at 10 p.m. Central Time, 11 p.m. Eastern, or 8 p.m. Pacific. So just for the sake of this, we'll just go ahead and use Eastern Time. So 11 p.m. Eastern for this is kind of the latest possible we're seeing. And I kind of called it a little bit. I said, based on what I'm seeing and based on how the NHC is tagging this, it does look like to me this will develop in the next 24 to 36 hours, and it looks like I might be right on the money with that. As we go ahead and show you the satellite imagery very quickly on this, as well as a few other things. So here's the Eastern Pacific right here, the EPAC. Right here, you are seeing more and more rotation around this. You are seeing more organized convection. You are seeing a stronger outflow boundary over here as well. So we're going to have to watch that as well. But ultimately, what this needs to do now is it needs to have that low-level center of circulation. You need to have that mid-level and low-level center of circulation kind of stacked together and ultimately drill down and allow for that development, that initial development to take place. And then after that, boom, it's a tropical depression, completely rotating over one center of circulation. And then from then on out, it's expected to rapidly organize and develop and potentially strengthen, according to some of the stuff I have looked at. Here's the ship's run we have on this for you. This is on Twitter. Shout out to Yoshi for posting this right here. Invest 90E has been designated, and we will and we already have a ship's forecast on it, and it's fairly aggressive for our first storm. Expecting a Category 2 peak, actually, at around 85 knots, which is 100 miles per hour. And ultimately, what you're looking at is wind shear. It's going to be in relatively low wind shear for the next 60 hours, and then it's going to be increasing a little bit to about 25 knots, and then from then on out, it's expected to get torn apart from dry air, as well as the relative humidity gradually decreases as time continues to go on. But ultimately, the first indicators are calling for a Category 2 hurricane in the Eastern Pacific. It's going to stay out to sea. Thankfully, no one's going to get impacted by that unless you're by the coast and you have rip currents. But the reason I'm doing this and the reason I'm showing you guys all of this is mainly for my own sake, to kind of practice with this as we continue to get closer to the hurricane season. So here we go. Let's go ahead now and move to some forecast runs. We're going to go ahead and go to the Eastern Pacific. Let's go ahead and go to the regions real quickly, the EPAC, and we'll use the European, the GFS, and the Canadian runs as well. Here's the European right here. We'll go ahead and use the 0Z Euro since that goes the furthest out. 0Z European has the system organizing and developing, gets down to about 994 millibars, nearing hurricane strength actually, before wind shear starts to tear it apart and before the system starts to move through dry air, which will ultimately tear it apart, which, matter of fact, I do want to check the dry air forecast real quickly. The dry air looks like right now it's still in a pretty good area of moisture. The inflow is kind of giving it a little bit more time for it to develop, giving it more moisture. You still have that huge dry slot that no matter how much convection goes through there, no matter how much moist air goes through there, it's not going to go away anytime soon. ladies and gentlemen, and that's what this system's going to run into in the next couple of days. So it basically has about 60 hours for it to organize, develop, and intensify before it moves into this dry air mass and starts to weaken. So that's the kind of general thing we're looking at with this, and that's why it's going to weaken so quickly after it develops and strengthens. So that's the first thing. Also taking a quick look at the wind shear as well. Here's the wind shear for you right now in the Eastern Pacific. Wind shear, actually, we can also use the Atlantic one, for example. For where the wind shear is right now, where this system's developing, relatively low, around 5 to 10 knots, but it is in this dry slot, around 25 to 30 knots, and that wind shear, coupled with dry air, expected to entrain into the system and start to choke it out, is what's ultimately going to allow for the system to weaken and not really do much to people in Baja California, to the Mexican coast, those areas right there. So that's kind of why it's not so much of a threat. I'm still watching it, obviously, for shipping concerns and for rip currents and all of that stuff. Also, it is the first system of the season, and I am kind of using that to kind of practice, but ultimately, that's the kind of stuff we are looking at. Ocean heat content and global sea surface temperatures, though, in those 60 hours is going to be more than enough to favor development and intensification. 30-plus degrees Celsius waters, which for those of you tuning in from the United States is 86 degrees Fahrenheit, more than enough for tropical development. The magic number is 80 degrees Fahrenheit or about 27 degrees Celsius. However, it can happen in temperatures lower than that. I've seen, for example, Hurricane Dawn back in 2023 develop and strengthen in water temperatures that were around 75 degrees. It can happen. Does it happen nearly as often? No. But can it happen? Yes. And this is one of those scenarios where that's not going to be worried about because it'll be dissipated by the time it even gets to those cooler waters, and that's a story for another time. Ocean heat content also really good where it's developing right now, around 100 OHC or so as this system continues to develop, and it's going to take full advantage of all this ocean heat content, which is basically how hot the water is and how deep down it goes. It's going to take full advantage of that and allow for more intensification. 100 OHC is conducive for rapid strengthening. Anything higher than that, well, you got quite a bit of a situation going on for yourself. So that's just briefly what we're looking at right here with the European. Let's go ahead and show you the GFS as well, just to kind of give you some context. The GFS is going pretty aggressive and is in general agreement with the ship's run from what I was seeing very quickly, and we'll have to see what happens. The GFS does actually have the system make landfall in northwestern Mexico, but given the dry air and the wind shear and all of that stuff, I don't really trust it. I don't think it's going to make landfall. If it does, it's going to be as a remnant low near Baja California, so we're going to have to pay attention to that. Last run we're going to show you is the Canadian run. Canadian run pretty much has the system running out of juice as it approaches the Yucatan Peninsula and stays around tropical storm strength, but we'll have to see what happens with this as time continues to go on. So now that we've kind of talked about briefly what's going on with this tropical system that has a 100% shot of development according to the NHC, which will be Tropical Storm Alvin at some point. Now we can go ahead and pivot more towards the Atlantic Basin real quickly because we have a lot to talk about over there in terms of what we're seeing with the models, in terms of what we're seeing with kind of satellite imagery, and all of that stuff, and we have a lot to dissect with you in this video, so be sure you stay tuned for that. Here's what we have going on. We have a tropical wave. Matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the surface analysis here. We have a tropical wave currently in the eastern Atlantic. It's actually right here, around 46 degrees west right here. That's the tropical wave that myself and my tropical team at Storms United is paying attention to, because that tropical wave is expected to cross into the Caribbean Sea and then enter into a relatively favorable environment, and then potentially develop. However, I have been noticing some mixed signals, whether it's going to be the tropical wave that provides the moisture, or the Central American gyre that provides the wave, or if it's vice versa, and all of that. And I'll explain to you why in just a second. But ultimately, that's the surface analysis right here. We have a tropical wave to pay attention to. That's the one to pay attention to, and based on satellite imagery, it's hovering right about here, relatively in some of this convection right here as it's kind of starting to detach from the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ for short, as it moves towards the Lesser Antilles. Lesser Antilles in the next few days is going to see some pretty stormy weather over there, so you're going to want to pay attention to that. Looking at water vapor imagery, for right now. This wave is also in a relatively moist environment, and you also have this part of the Caribbean Sea, which is what I'm going to pivot towards starting right now. This area is in a relatively dry area right now, and we'll have to see how that dryness evolves and how that dry slot starts to kind of get mixed out by more moisture, by more convection, by more of this potentially the Central American gyre and this tropical wave. And I will say this tropical wave, if it does end up just doing what maybe some are forecasting and just kind of moistening up the Caribbean Sea and then allowing the gyre to take over, that might be a net positive. I mean, either way, that's going to be a net positive depending on how this goes and depending on how healthy the wave is as it approaches the Caribbean Sea. But ultimately, the main question is, how do we mix out this dry air and how do we deal with the wind shear? Because if we go ahead and show you the wind shear profiles right now, wind shear profiles not particularly that good for tropical development. You're looking at 50 plus knots of wind shear in a lot of areas, 40 plus knots in a lot more of a widespread area. Not good for tropical development. However, based on some of the runs, the wind shear does start to weaken by a pretty considerable margin. So we're going to want to pay attention to that, and we can go ahead and actually show you that right here. Let's go ahead and pull up the GFS, ladies and gentlemen, and we can go ahead and pull up the wind shear as well as a few other things to take a look at. Let's go ahead and start with the 200 to 850 millibar wind shear. This is our most important factor right here. So yeah, like I said, not great for tropical development right now, but watch what starts to happen in the next few days or so. This is not 4 days out, not too much. You start to see a slight weakening. The cracks are starting to show a little bit more. And then you start seeing more and more kind of anomalies. You start seeing more and more of that wind shear start to slowly weaken. And then look what things start to get a bit more interesting. You start seeing more of a ridging pattern across much of the Caribbean Sea and more of that wind shear start to lift, particularly in the southwestern Caribbean Sea. Right here, you're starting to see less wind shear in the south and more wind shear in the north. I will say, if this does develop in the way some of these runs are indicating, this could actually be a very big net positive for the tropical system, because what a wind shear profile like this does is it helps enhance the outflow, and as long as it stays far enough away from the center of circulation, it enhances the it'll enhance the outflow, and it give this system more time to breathe and more room to breathe, and potentially tighten the pressure gradient and allow for it to intensify at a pretty fast rate. That's a relatively common course that has happened. It happened with Helene, happened with Milton, happened with Beryl, happened with Lee last year. It happened with a lot of things right there. So we're gonna have to see what happens right here as we pay attention. But the wind shear does weaken quite a bit in the Caribbean and even in the Gulf of Mexico too. Another thing I'm going to take a look at is the shear anomalies, because the shear anomalies are going to be pretty interesting and be pretty critical to what we're potentially looking at right here. Shear anomalies going out right now, it's relatively stronger than average wind shear for right now, except for that one pocket where we do see that development potentially happening. So we're going to have to see what happens. I can go ahead and also show you the 0Z. 0Z was a bit more different. It had a lot of the northwestern Caribbean seeing less shear than average within a 5-day time span. So we are seeing some fluctuations here, obviously, but ultimately what I am taking a look at is basically you are seeing those shear patterns, and I will say the shear is generally more unfavorable for tropical development, or at least strong tropical development like the GFS has been indicating, and we will get to that in a second, and I will explain to you why I do not trust such a strong return on that. But ultimately, that's what we're looking at right there in terms of the wind shear. I want to take a look at the moisture, because this is going to be very critical as well. The moisture, I would argue, is going to be more important than the wind shear. So here's what we have going on. We have this tropical wave right now in the Atlantic. It's going to be moving through much of the Caribbean Sea, start bringing more moisture with it. And it actually moistens up quite a large area of the Eastern Pacific Ocean. Not Eastern Pacific, the Eastern Caribbean Sea, and then this area right here actually stays relatively dry. But look at this. You have a relatively moist Gulf of Mexico as well, too, except for this dry slot in the Gulf Coast over here. But you do see that moisture infusion, in part due to the Central American gyre starting to act up, and in part due to this tropical wave, really start to impact a lot of these regions, and that's when your tropical development is going to start kicking in. Starting around June 3rd or so is what most models are tending to agree with. is when those conditions get favorable enough for to allow for tropical development to take place. And that's something we're going to want to pay attention to. So that's our moisture, that's our wind shear. Let's go ahead now and take a look at some of the ensembles as well as the temperatures, all of that stuff. I want to take a look at the global sea surface temperatures and kind of extrapolate a little bit. Sea surface temperatures are pretty key with this as well. 28 plus degrees Celsius, which is 82 plus degrees Fahrenheit for those of you tuning in on the Gulf Coast. Basically, you have a pretty good area of warm water. The water is already, in my opinion, pretty primed for tropical development. It's just the other factors that are not paying as much attention, that are not being as cooperative, and they won't be as cooperative, at least regularly, until late July or early August. But I am still talking about them now because it's very important to look at those shear patterns and those charts early on to indicate a potential pattern. So that's what we're looking at right here with the global sea surface temperatures. Next thing we'll go ahead and take a quick gander at is the North Atlantic Ocean heat content for you guys right here. Here's the OHC. OHC, where this system is anticipated to develop, is the highest in the Atlantic Ocean right now. It's May 27th, 2025. You're seeing up past 100 OHC in a lot of the northwestern Caribbean Sea, up to 125 in a few isolated areas too, which is quite interesting to say the very least. It's not 2024. Early 2024 levels are, as a matter of fact, it's actually around 2023 levels, if you think about it, actually, a little bit. But by and large, you have plenty of fuel in the tank for tropical development to happen. It's just the wind shear and the dry air that are going to cause problems. Now let's go ahead and show you the ensemble runs. I've been kind of taking a quick gander at this. Here's the 0Z European ensemble runs. Still a relatively weak signal based on the returns we have so far, but the signals we are getting do have more power to them, and we can go ahead and show you the 12Z as well. 12Z definitely sees more signals to this as well, so we're going to want to pay attention to that, as well as we're seeing more and more of these returns, more and more of these signals come in very, very quickly, and we're going to have to pay attention to that. Looking at the GFS ensembles, actually, let me go ahead and move this over a little bit to show you guys that. My apologies. So let's go ahead and do that real quickly. Here's the GFS 12Z. We can actually go out far enough, thankfully, to kind of give a okay. I appreciate the thing right here. But yeah, we are seeing those ensembles starting to get more concentrated, I am noticing. The main question I have with it, though, is basically, where is this going to develop and where is this going to kind of approach? Right now, that's a question I'm not too worried about in the short term. I'm mainly concerned more about the placement and how consistent the placement is. And it looks to me that the consistent placement is actually in the southwestern Caribbean Sea, and that's leaning me towards more of a potential gyre setup potentially happening sooner rather than later. And you have a lot of these ensembles kind of having the system hugging the coast of Central America right here and not really developing, but you're seeing an increase of ensemble runs right here that are having this moving further to the north and more into the Caribbean Sea, and we're going to want to pay attention, especially compared to what we were seeing at 0Z with the GFS runs with that. We're seeing more of a trend, or at least more of a shift towards going out to sea in the Caribbean, and then just kind of allowing for this system to organize and develop with the lower shear and higher moisture values. So that's what we're noticing. We're going to have to see what the data is going to look like tomorrow and the next day before we can start streaming and do all of that stuff. I want more data and information, but I still wanted to cover this just because, hey, this is something that we might want to watch early on. It may not be a big threat, but it is a threat regardless, so we're going to want to keep close tabs on it. So next thing we're going to go ahead and show you the runs, and I'm going to go ahead and start with the 12Z GFS just to kind of show you how ridiculous this is. So the 12Z GFS has the system organizing and developing off the Central American gyre, gets up to hurricane strength as it approaches the Yucatan Peninsula, and then it kind of moves to the west and weakens a little bit, and then starts to strengthen to around a Category 2 hurricane. I have multiple problems with this run. Number one, the shear is too strong. Although I will say the vorticity is pretty stacked on this. I actually took a quick gander at this. Here's the vorticity at 850, relatively stacked throughout the entire run of this, actually. Let's go ahead and do a quick run through of this. Yeah, pretty stacked. 700, pretty stacked. 500's pretty stacked. But I don't like the shear, and I don't like how it's just kind of keeping the dry air out at that particular point. at that point, because dry air is going to intrude eventually in these tropical systems, especially with the amount of dry air early on in the Gulf of Mexico. So I don't particularly trust this run that much. And showing you the European as well. European is pretty interesting because it's generally the more conservative run. It does actually have something developing, but it stays relatively weak, relatively broad, and crashes into the Bay of Campeche in Mexico over here, similar to what Alberto did last year. So ultimately, we're seeing some mixed signals, but the models are getting closer and closer in agreement with some sort of development happening, and we'll continue to keep you updated here on the Pat's Path Predictor channel. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. Also, if you want to come ask us questions or be a part of the team, or you just want to hang out, be sure to join the Storms United Discord server. The link to that is in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe.